Now, if the housekeeper's theory was true, that would mean JonBenet died as a result of the blow to the head, but that's not what the coroner found, nor what the autopsy seems to show. In my view, if this is what happened, and if Patsy did feel for a pulse, there would have been a pulse. This scenario also doesn't explain the twin marks on JonBenet's shoulder, as well as the mark on her cheek, which seem to come from the same source. Did Patsy use a stun gun? I doubt it. Did the Ramseys even have a stun gun? I doubt it.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Let's get back to our subject. The housekeeper doesn't recognize the stick and cord contraption as anything other than as a garrote. The housekeeper writes, but what if JonBenet was slowly strangled exotically with, of all things, a garrote? So you broke off one of your paintbrushes, this is addressing Patsy, took the white nylon cord and twisted it around her neck. She, meaning JonBenet, might still have been revived, but you didn't know it. You just pulled the cord tight around her neck until it was red. Now, when I first researched this case, and I remember feeling very intimidated at the time, I felt there was virtually nothing I could likely contribute. But I remember when I heard this particular theory, it rang completely false to me. And that's when I thought, you know what, I think I could possibly contribute some sensible analysis to this case. You know, there are many examples of staging in the Ramsey case, but some people wrongly think all of it is staging, while others wrongly think that none of it is. For example, Lou Smith seems to accept that the ransom note is real, that the ransom note isn't staged, as crazy as that is. I think it takes a keen mind, an intuitive mind, to tell the difference between the original crime scene and what was later done to try to alter it. And I guess apparently very few people are capable of thinking in this way, sensitively, systematically, and in an analytical as well as a synthetic manner. Synthetic in the sense of synthesizing a scenario, coming up with a fusion of ideas that creates a connected whole. And my impression of the Ramsey case is that almost everyone defaults to they see the case through their own hearts and minds and psychology. They don't allow the case to speak for itself. They don't let the evidence guide them even when they say or think that is what they're doing. The housekeeper doesn't recognize the stick and cord contraption, or does she? And I think, we need an ominous boom. I remember, these are her words, I remember just such a cord wrapped in just such a way around a box in the basement near or next to where her body was found. Let's repeat those words, but just be a bit more specific about them. I remember just such a cord, such as the cord wrapped around JonBenet's neck, wrapped in just such a way, in other words, the cord wrapped around JonBenet's neck, wrapped in just such a way around a box in the basement next to where her body was found.
It is close now. So close to achieving its goal.
The housekeeper seems to recognize the same cord, but although she implies something about the configuration, the knot, the wrapping of the cord around a box, that was the same, she doesn't seem to care, or she doesn't seem to notice or pay real attention to the knot. And then she writes, I remember a lot, Patsy. The tape appeared to be cut with a knife. She writes, you kept trying to make it an exotic crime scene, didn't you? You even taped your daughter's wrists and her mouth shut, cutting the tape with a small Swiss Army knife that would later be found beside her body the next day. I remember that knife. Now, what is wrong with that statement? Well, first of all, I don't think JonBenet's wrists were taped. Again, she's half right in that her wrists were bound, just not with tape. I'm also not sure if it's accurate to say that the duct tape was cut with a knife. Does it look cut or torn? Lou Smith believes the nylon cord was cut, though. In my view, the person who placed the duct tape over JonBenet's mouth is the same person who authored the ransom note. In other words, the source of that staging is the same thing. It's also covering up, in a way, the mouth, the voice, the reality of what is going on. In a weird way, covering JonBenet's mouth, if you think of it in a symbolic way, it prevents her, the sort of ghost of JonBenet, from telling her own story, and instead it allows the manufacture of some kind of different story. Think about the duct tape, the fabric of the duct tape, as being an analogy to the 3 pages that's the ransom note. They kind of go hand in hand. But I would also say it's not the same person who wielded the paintbrush and cord. So the person who wrote the note and who put the duct tape over JonBenet's mouth, it's not the same person who wielded the paintbrush and cord, who constructed that. And then for the first time in her story, the housekeeper mentions JonBenet's brother. Burke had walked around the house whittling with it a month before, meaning walked around the house whittling with the Swiss Army knife a month earlier. And I told you I put it at the top of the linen closet near JonBenet's bedroom when I confiscated it from him. So one does wonder whether Burke was searching in the area of JonBenet's bedroom himself for this knife, or whether Patsy simply gave it to Burke. Only you knew and John knew the exact location of that hideaway in the linen closet. After you finished taping JonBenet's mouth, you carried her downstairs and hid her body in the basement inside a small hidden room, the wine room you called it, even though there was never any wine stored there. Now, the fiber evidence does lend some support potentially to this part of the housekeeper's hypothesis. She writes, you then wrapped her in a favorite white blanket of hers. Now, again, this brings us back to this crime, caring inside a crime, which you took from the dryer, except her Barbie nightgown was stuck to it, because you never did have the sense to throw in a static cling strip with the wash. So you laid the nightie next to her. You had stored the plastic Christmas trees there in that wine cellar. Strange, isn't it? I had worked for you for nearly a year, and I didn't even know that room existed until you had me get those trees out of there. Now, that kind of implies that even the housekeeper didn't know that room existed in the basement until it was approaching Christmas time. An intruder wouldn't have found that place, not in a million years. Only you or John would know its location. Your house was a 22-room rabbit warren and maze that even my husband once got lost in when he was doing some work for you. I can hear your voice in the note, and this is perhaps the most startling insight of all. Not only her recognizing the handwriting, but Patsy's voice, so to speak, in the ransom note. The housekeeper writes, what to do next? Well, a ransom note might be nice. It would explain why JonBenet was suddenly missing, but you forgot one thing. The handwriting and language of the note were all yours. We really need to emphasize that, and maybe it's time for another ominous bang. Because the housekeeper writes, I can hear your voice in the note. The word hence, for example, was in your Christmas cards and letters, and a word you like to use in conversation. The phrase, use that good Southern common sense, is what you kidded John about, since he was anything but Southern, having been born and raised in Michigan. The phrase, fat cat, is what your mother Nidra used to call you after you and John became rich. The ransom demand asked that the money be put in an attaché with a proper accent mark over the last E in attaché. I remember how careful you always were to put the proper accent mark over the E in the second syllable of JonBenet's name. The ransom note even ended with the initials SBTC. Do you remember how fond you were, Patsy, of using initials as abbreviations for all sorts of expressions? Preparing the crime scene and writing the ransom note must have been time-consuming and exhausting. You were up all night before you found the ransom note just before 6 a.m. in the morning. You didn't even have time to change your clothes from the day before. So what the housekeeper is implying here was that Patsy was not only up all night, but that she was up all night in the same clothes she wore to the dinner party. And what's interesting is that when the cops encountered Patsy that morning, she was fully made up. And that in itself is a mismatch. The fact that she was wearing tired old dinner party clothes from the night before, yet she'd freshened up her makeup. Don't you think that's strange? And this is an excerpt from Foreign Faction. by James Kolar. Officer Rick French was the first to arrive on scene at 05:56 hours and was greeted at the front door of the residence by Patsy Ramsey. That's interesting. Patsy meets the officer, not John. John Ramsey was visible from the front door, standing in the kitchen at the end of a length of hallway that ran toward the rear of the house. That's also interesting that John doesn't open the door to the officer. Patsy does, and John is kind of elsewhere in the house. French observed John Ramsey to be dressed in a long-sleeved blue and white pinstriped shirt and khaki pants. Patsy's hair and makeup appeared to be neatly done, and she was dressed in a red sweater and black slacks. Now, I've heard people say, well, she just quickly put on some clothes, she was going to go down and make coffee and then change again. Well, the fact that her hair and makeup's done doesn't really suggest that. And think about this, Patsy is all done up before 6 o'clock in the morning, whereas think about what she looked like on Christmas morning in that last picture with JONBENET. The housekeeper goes on to write, "You began screaming as soon as John had awakened, and he didn't even know what had happened when you called the police. John didn't know what had happened to JONBENET when he found the body hidden in the basement. When did you tell him?" Now, of course, this is the million-dollar question. When exactly did Patsy and John really find JONBENET and find out what had happened to her? What time was that? And do you think the housekeeper is right that John took a melatonin and slept through it all? I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you, and I'll see you guys next time.